All right, guys. So for module two, we're going to be looking at a brief history of visual storytelling. And really, this is brief. Um, if you were to take like foundations of media and communication, we go through the history of like each of these aspects in a lot more depth and why they play such a big part, not only in visual storytelling, but just in media and communication overall in our society. But this gives you just kind of an idea of where the idea and aspect of visual storytelling came from. Um, Really, it all started from, this visualization on cave from, cave paintings and how they told stories through that aspect. They took oral stories and tried to make them into pictures. Um, to what we're doing now in the 21st century and just kind of this mind-blowing adventure of where we've come since then. And so you have to kind of just think about all the aspects that go into that and why this is so important for us as human beings and a society. So to begin with, this is kind of a quick version infographic about how we started with storytelling and kind of where it goes through those different things. One of the things I want you to remember is that visual storytelling is all about using images and visuals to share a narrative, right? To share a story, to share ideas and emotions. It's really a fundamental part of our culture, and it's involved in such incredible ways. And this short graphic in this lecture kind of tells you a little bit about that. Um, so it starts with, we talk about the cave paintings, then we go into ancient Egypt with hieroglyphics, then we go into ancient Greeks and their plays. Then they had shadow plays in Asia. Then we get the troubadours, Shakespeare, and the Globe Theater. We get into the printing press. Just from there it evolves into movies and radio and the golden age of TV and the cinema and the internet, and now we are into transmedia storytelling, alternate reality and games, and it's just an ever evolving idea, but at its core it's really simple, right? We like to see how stories partake. Um, Even if you're just reading or you're listening to a story, you create these images in your head, right? And the more rich description and um, telling of the story, the better, right? And visuals just help to aid in that. This is just a funny little map. It just shows you kind of some territories of visual storytelling, and we'll talk a little bit about these areas here today. So you have the ocean of opportunity, which is where anything could happen, right? You have the film empire, print nation, the video game territory, and the digital lands, which has uncharted territories, right? This is where we are right now. This is where we are going. And so this is just another visual representation of kind of what we're going to be looking at. So, like I said, we started out with cave drawings. So, this one is in a cave in France. It's about 33,000 years old, or so we think. And these drawings, we have found them all over the world, from drawings like this to more symbolic type things to even people trying to come up with their own language. Um, Visuals have been a way for us to pass on stories when we are no longer able to orally tell them. Again, this is in Spain. This is about 18,000 years old. This is a tapestry that is about circa 1070s. Again, just another way for us to tell what's going on in our world. This is the tapestry set up in a museum so you can look at it. And it looks like it's repetitive, but each section has its own, like, part of the story. And so what is the role of visuals? So when you think about like cave drawings to tapestries to what we have now, Jeff Smith, a cartoonist, said that visuals are there to enhance the story, not the story to enhance the visuals. Um, so you're always going to have some kind of narrative, right? And visuals just help us take that narrative to a new level. The visual serves as its own language. So you can have the visual without the story, but they go hand in hand. But more often, they're very effectively complementary of each other, and you you want one with the other, right? It's like a complete package. So, we went from drawings on the cave to like more tapestry type things. Um, then visuals started becoming more play-like. So this was kind of the start of what we see, with television and movies and TikTok now. It all started with taking a story and playing it out with human subjects. And that could have been from anything from like tragedies to reading poems, anything and everything. Even just somebody going into the town square and telling about what's going on in the city is a way of putting a visual to the story, right? Because you have a visual representation of somebody doing that. Then, of course, that have evolved into one of the best visual representations of narrative, which is Shakespeare and the Globe Theater. Shakespeare really took this idea of pen and paper and then transforming that into the stage to a whole new level. And we have him to thank for not only, these wonderful plays he left us with and different parts of our language, but just the idea that, we can use our talents as humans to tell a story. This is a Bible picture from 1325, around the same time that I say around the same time, relatively, that Shakespeare was writing and producing plays. We are also getting the printing press, and along with printing information for people, they were also printing out pictures or trying to copy them, right? To give another visual aid. If you've ever looked at some of the first like Gutenberg Bibles and things from the Gutenberg printing press, they're so intricately done, and it's amazing. If you ever have the chance to like see some of that come through either at Tech or another university or just a museum, it's really interesting to get to go and see these things, because even as simple as they are, they're so complex. Once we made it past the printing press, we started getting into the idea of really capturing life, not just with pencil and paper and etching and then painting, but really trying to capture what it was in the moment. And that's where we're getting into the more modern type things. And when you think 1839, that's not really modern, but in reality, this is kind of where the Industrial Revolution hit with visual elements. And so we get the process of photography. In 1839, the same year as the daguerreotype, we get the first kind of film camera by William Henry Fox Talbot. And he introduced what is called paper film process. We also had the process where we would print pictures on metal. The calotype used a translucent paper or a negative, which we used for a long time. And then these elements eventually went into making a motion picture type camera. The first camera really had this box type element to it, and it would take an image and flip it through a mirror and then transpose it onto some kind of material. Um, again, it was a replication of like painting and that process, but it was put into more of an industrial type element. This is actually the first picture that was taken. It is of a cityscape. It's really terrible, but it gives you the idea of, right, that we are developing and growing as homo narratives and visual storytellers. We're wanting to make that leap. Again, just the process of how we're getting more advanced in this era. I think these were maybe 50 years apart, maybe not even that much. Then we're getting into the Civil War era. And the thing about the Civil War era, just like any war really that we had visual representation of, it started to make a big impact because people were not just seeing the glorified version of, Washington on a boat in the winter during the Revolutionary War. We were seeing actual people and their lives during this time. And we were also seeing the bloodier parts of this, right? The death of the Civil War. And this made a huge impact, not only in photography and in our nation, but just in the idea of what visuals could do to tell a story and persuade an audience, right? This was the first color image. It was by James Clerk Maxwell in 1861. So again, not long after like the Civil War. And to get the different colors of this tartan ribbon, he used different filters that he took the picture several times with the different filters on top of each other to get this. So you're seeing this developmental um era we go through. And again, this is a very quick history of it, but it gives you an idea that, we're developing these processes very quickly, and they're becoming just inherent to how we tell stories. So, along with photography, we started working really closely at looking at how we could take photographs and make them into moving pictures. The first time we did that was with the racing horse. So the idea was that these two gentlemen wanted to see how a horse run. Did they run with all their feet touching the ground, or did they trot? How did it work? So they made a bet about which way they thought it was that they thought the horse ran. Sorry. And then they went to an inventor and had him take multiple pictures in a row and put them together, and it made this motion stop type photo video. And they put it into what was called the zoopraxiscope machine. Basically, it was a circle and you spun it, and then you could look at the photos going in real time. So it was similar to a flip book, if you've ever seen those, where you slowly change the photo, whereas you flip it, it moves. And so this was the beginning of that. And basically, it was the idea that our vision could put these images together in 1/24th of a second and see them move in real time. From there, we just kept advancing. So we've gone from cave drawings to paintings to being on the theater to taking photos to having stop motion almost. And photographs really were like the mecca of this becoming what it is today. They afforded us a lot more visual documentation. It afforded us more credibility. It allowed us to really start being creative with our visuals, right? And painting did that to an extent, but you could, painting took a long time and photos didn't take as long. And so you could take them more and represent history in a more realistic way. With these advancements, we were really starting to see more of a sequential panel type visual where things were going, in order, and it wasn't just a one-off. So once we had the zoopraxiscope, we started getting into more cinematography. In 1891, Edison built the first film studio, which was called the Black Maria. And basically, it was just a black box in a sense where you could go film things. And then they would like show these films in a box that you could pay money to go like look into a small lens. They were called like peep shows. You'd pay like a quarter and it would run through them. The Lumiere brothers really took this idea and went even further, and they patented the cinematograph in 1895. It was really the first projector. And then Edison saw that this was really a potential. Another kid named Thomas Armet was working on the Vitascope at the same time. So Edison bought his patents and really took off with that. If you really go into the history, Edison had his hand in photography and video and just all those different types of visual elements, along with the other inventions that he was a part of. But once we get through that, we move on to not just showing pictures in a row that kind of put a story together, like the horse running or the monkey tapping the symbols together, but we really started saying, okay, let's take this a step further and let's get into narratives. So George Millet, he was French, was the first to make a narrative film. And basically, it was a voyage to the moon. It started with one scene and one shot, and then eventually moved on to sequential. I'm so sorry, guys. Sequential shots in other locations, and then he edited them together to make a film. Now, not all films before that really had a narrative to them, like the horse running or the monkey or whatever. They were really just showing off the technology at the time. This was the first time that they had a film that had a narrative to it, right? A true story. With that narrative, we got editing, right? So, A Trip to the Moon was the first one. And then The Great Train Robbery was the second. We go back and forth about which one was really the first, depending on who you talk to. Somebody will say one or the other, but they came out around the same time. And basically, they were using mobile cameras, they were intercutting scenes together, and they were making the first movies. Um, then it was just called a montage, right? Because you were taking two different scenes and putting them together. Now we do that without even thinking and create short movies all the time and like TikTok and Instagram, right? But at the time it was this huge deal and it was expensive and it took a lot of time and effort. And so when the film was finished and they put it into theaters, it became this really big deal. And that's where we started seeing Nickelodeons pop up, and these were the first like movie houses or movie theaters. They had about 100 seats in them. Um, it was about 5 cents to get into them, so nickel. Nickelodeon is where that comes from. And you could go in and you could watch films over and over again. And so you weren't having to look into this tiny little box anymore. You could go sit in an area and watch it. And yes, Nickelodeon, the cartoon channel, got its name from this idea. So from there, we started seeing more of a factory type studio. And people were making films a lot quicker, and they saw that there was a big popularity to them. People wanted them. They liked this idea of seeing a visual to a narrative. Sound familiar? Now, the first like feature length film that came out was A Birth of a Nation. It was very controversial, still is controversial. Um, and D.W. Griffith really wanted to create a movie that was full of passion, emotion, suspense. It was a silent film because we hadn't got into talkies just yet. Um, but it was also very racist. Um, it's considered one of the most controversial films even to this day. It conceived a can it ugh, so sorry guys. It received a lot of backlash, but it also received a lot of support, right? Because we were just in that time in our nation. But it also set some standards from the film industry. And so there's lots of reviews about it if you want to go look at it. But you have to mention that this was like the first of the big silent films that people went and saw, and it set a precedent. From there, we had silent films. It was a big era. You have things like Charlie Chaplin, um, all these silent movie, stars. It was a big thing. But then we started getting the idea and the technology to put film and music and sound together. There's usually like a musical underscore, but it was played separately. But now we could start putting um, dialogue with our films. So the first film was sound. It could have been one of these three: Don Juan, The Jazz Singer, and Lights of New York. They all came out within a year of each other, and it kind of just depends on who you are on when you decide which one made the biggest impact. A lot of people say it was The Jazz Singer. Um, and The Jazz Singer is mentioned if you watch Singing in the Rain. That was kind of like the big deal, right? If you've never seen Singing in the Rain, it's a musical about silent film stars um, having to readjust their life to star in talkies, hence The Jazz Singer being part of that. Sound brought a new genre to film, and musicals became a really big part of that. But actors really had to think about what they were doing because they could no longer like make these big pantomime motions. They had to actually act. And a lot of them didn't have the voice to be in talkies. They had the face, but they didn't have the voice. And so they would either be dubbed or they lost their job. Sound also made film a lot more complicated to produce and a lot more expensive. But as we see even today, it paid off. Once we saw talkies take off, we really saw that video and audio together were complementary and telling stories. Um, we really started wanting to strive for a more realistic interactivity. So it wasn't just, like the silent films that were way overly acted and dramatic. We wanted it to be more real to us. And because we had more technological advancements, we were able to start creating these more complex videos and stories, I guess films at that time. And this has continued even into today. Two of the big innovations in film and visuals was Snow White and the Wizard of Oz. So Snow White was produced in 1937 by Walt Disney. It was his very first feature-length film, and it was also the first animated feature film to ever be produced. It was a huge deal. Disney was not sure if he was ever going to get it made. He went through a lot of financial struggles to make it, but once he did, he really created this name for himself that he had been trying to make for a long time. And then from there is history. Disney is the largest media company in the world. But if we didn't have Snow White, things might be a little different. And so he took his ability to be an animator and really push the boundaries. And then we have The Wizard of Oz. It was in theaters in 1939. It, of course, is an American musical. If you've never seen it, it starts out in black and white and then goes into Technicolor. And this was the first time that we saw Technicolor on the big screen outside of animation. Everything was black and white until then. Um, and it became MGM's most expensive production at that time to make. Um, there were a lot of changes made to The Wizard of Oz from the actual book. And we got the ruby slippers simply because the ruby red of the slippers showed up better than the silver of the book. And so now that is a trademark of the story. From there, we go into Citizens Kane, which is one of the most well-renowned films. It's proclaimed as the best film even to this day. We get into things like Blade Runner from 1982, which is also an acclaimed film that saw even more advancements. And then we get into things like Avatar, right? So both Avatars, Titanic, the Avengers, they have all been like the most viewed films in theaters, the top produced, some of the most visually appealing. And all of that is just an advancement from where we got with cave drawings. Once we did that, we get into the era of television. The golden age of Hollywood was 1930 to 1945. That's when we really saw film starting to pick up. From there, we learned about the technology to create television on a smaller scale for movies. We really wanted to expand on that. From the 1930s to the 1950s, we made some really experimental leaps with broadcast, and we could go directly into people's homes. We had a lot of back and forth about that with the government. A lot of federal laws were put into place so that licenses with cable and televisions and different things couldn't become outrageous to people. And some of those laws are still in, you know, tact today. And then, of course, from television, we get into what we are in today, which is interactivity. Each area of visual storytelling is just a new innovative practice that we are seeing, that we are learning, that we are evolving from. When you think about the leap from television to the internet to streaming to social media, we've gone leaps and bounds in just the last like 30 years. And it's always going to continue moving forward. Caputo in 2003 said that history has demonstrated that a really popular medium never dies. And even more to that, the really popular medium that never dies is visual storytelling. So again, this is just a short, quick version of the history of visuals and how we've advanced from cave drawings to, the latest dance craze on TikTok. But it gives you an idea of where we started and where we are going.